I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Welcome everyone to GM Tools Theater of the Mind Encounters. So today we're going to be talking about how you can use Theater of the Mind in order to avoid using a flip mat or other map with miniatures, pawns, or other great and wonderful Paizo products that you don't want to use. And instead, just do everything in your head and narrate it and tell your story while still playing a game with a large amount of tactical movements and environmental conditions and situations such as Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Or 1st Edition, really.
Mm-hmm.
So, basically, there's just a few major tips that we have, but our group pretty much always plays Theater of the Mind, and we do pretty well. If not, when we do play with maps, it's usually for a really, really complicated room with a lot going on and a huge number of area effects where, like, exactly who fits into the area of effect is incredibly crucial. Which typically is, like, no more than 3 or 4 times in an adventure path. And so far in War for the Crown, never.
Mm-hmm. So when doing a combat in Theater of the Mind, one of the most important things is to make sure that the players and GMs have the same sense of the space. So just because you're not using a battle map in front of everyone, that doesn't mean that you can't share the map with the players. So oftentimes we will have, oftentimes we might say, okay, well, you are in this dungeon, here's what the map of this dungeon looks like. But we're not going to necessarily be playing on the grid, but we can at least say, okay, you know that this is a room, you know that this is roughly a 40 by 40 room, and it's got some benches and tables, and they are along the walls, and otherwise the room isn't really that obstructed. So the first thing is just making sure, like let's say that you do have an obstruction, or like there's a big fountain in the center of the room, or that maybe there is something else in the room that could be a hazard of some sort. So the fountain in the center of the room is instead a big lake in the center of the room, and it's going to be slower to walk through that. Or there is something in the center of the room that is an uncontrolled reaction that if you hit that with fire, it's probably going to explode. Letting the players know up front what the situation of the room is, and also remaining in constant communication with them about the room. So when doing Theater of the Mind, one of the things to keep in mind is to err on the side of the players and to be sure to be providing them with information if it ever seems that they're acting in a way that has incomplete information. So, if the player says, oh, I'm going to go around and try to flank this person, and you know that back behind that person is some terrible hazard that's on the ground that they would have seen if they had a map, then you let them know, if you go to flank them, then you're stepping in this terrible hazard.
You're falling off a cliff rather than being like, well, good job, you fell off a cliff because there was just an obvious cliff there that you just walked off of. Ha! Shouldn't have said you were flanking them, huh?
Yeah.
Sometimes you wind up with a situation where, but like Linda said, you need to be generous, but you sort of just describe things in the most generous way. Like, for example, there was an encounter in War for the Crown where the enemy had, placed 10 by 10 traps just completely in a straight line between herself and the party. And there were 4 of them in a row. Now, the party could have gotten around those traps just pretty easily by going around. But the fighter, not Linda's fighter, but the other fighter, with his very specific movement speed, wanted to be able to approach her with actions to spare. So after the first trap, I asked, okay, you took this damage, do you want to try to go around her, which would take more actions. Keep going at her or stop. He's like, no, that's fine. It was just one. After the second one that was in a row,
Yeah.
I was like, there's two in a row. There might be more, and he still wanted to go straight. But
after the third one, he still wanted to keep going.
I kept asking him, and I would, if he wanted to go around, I would have done the pathfinding for him in a way to make sure he didn't hit them. But he would have spent an extra action, and he really wanted to be able to ready an action to disrupt her spellcasting. It turned out to be very helpful, but he ate like a huge number of traps in order to do that.
So when you say do the pathfinding for them, that hits on another facet of Theater of the Mind combat, which is, yes, the pathfinding for him. Which is not, in fact, puns about our game,
nope.
but is instead the idea of close enough, right? Like, if you can tell, yeah, they have enough movement to do this, it doesn't matter exactly how many squares it takes. You can just say, yeah, they have enough movement, yoink them around. When it comes to movement, Letus asks, how do you handle the person with 35 move versus the person with 25 move?
Well, basically, the way I handle it is that I have in my head exactly how far away things are. So if they are 35, then they can go 35. But let me give my tips for handling positioning in Theater of the Mind.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, what you generally need, unless there's weird hazards, and then you need to do a little bit more than this, is not necessarily like a 2D map in your head of everything, but what you need is an array of distances, which you can even write down on a piece of paper for yourself. It's very important to know...
Mic's acting up?
The mic's acting up, so there was just static, but not a pop. That's weird. Well, supposedly we're getting a Yeti mic. Hey, Alex, welcome.
Hi.
What was I saying? Oh, yes. If you have an array of distances, then you know, for instance, okay, well, this character who was in the front of the party line is 30 feet from that monster, and this person who was 10 feet behind them is now 40 feet from that monster, and the guy in the back is 50 feet from the monster. And that's generally useful if you know where the difficult terrain is positioned roughly. You can tell if it's going to take extra movement from them or if they have to go around a table. But if you have the distances, then you know, oh, the monster advanced 25 feet. Well, then the person who was 30 feet away is now right next to them, and so on.
So when starting the combat, I generally think of it in terms of distance groupings. So I'll think, okay, the party has a speed of 25 to 30 feet. The enemies start here. So I'm going to start when I start the combat, distance 30 people can reach, distance 35 people can reach everything. Distance 25 people can reach these people, but not the rest of themselves. So I think of it as distance groupings to start with, and then as the battle goes on, you form clumps, right? You form clumps as opponents converge on each other. And then so you'll say, okay, well, this clump is over here where the fighter is fighting the enemy rogue, and then the other enemy rogue comes around to flank. So that's clump 1. And then you have clump 2 where the party barbarian has charged the back line of the enemies, and then you have clump 3 where the party's ranged people are firing, and maybe an enemy has come up to that group.
And if you know the distance and orientation of those clumps, then you can figure out what's going on and how long it takes for one person to get to the other. You don't even have to do alternating diagonals if you just do it with distance, because then you know, yeah, sure, yeah, my distance here is, the group is 30 feet from the people here on the south to this clump up to the north. And this one that's sort of in the northeast is 40 feet over from the one in the north, and that means that it's 50 feet from the people who are in the south up to the people in the northeast, because it's a 3-4-5 Pythagorean triplet.
Or you can. I mean, if you.
Good morning,
yeah,
Polo
and
Crusader.
you can estimate too. You can estimate too as well, and definitely it's easier in PF2 with fewer attacks of opportunity since the exact path is less critical. But yeah, I generally envision them as clumps of people with distances away from each other. And anytime that I don't remember, like, wait, these two clumps are 30 feet away from each other. This person has a 30-foot movement speed. Are they in the back of this clump or the front of the clump? Then I'll just assume that it's whatever is most favorable for the PCs.
And like Kate says, it is easier in second edition with reactions being more specific to a type of creature, because you only need to know when the PCs do whatever is the special thing for the opponent's reaction. Whereas in Pathfinder First, everything could make an attack of opportunity, so it was very important to know if they ever moved from a threatened square to another threatened square. And there were donuts of threatening with reach weapons, which meant that there was a lot of figuring out, are you within the reach, where they can't attack you with the reach weapon, or what. Numbat is wondering if greater mobility in 2e combat makes it more difficult to track, and I think in some ways the fact that people choose to move around more does mean that you have to do those calculations more, but it's sort of more than canceled out by what Kate was saying, which is you only need to keep track of reactions in so much as the ones that creatures have. So, for instance, if you don't have any PCs or monsters in the fight with attack of opportunity, there's a whole lot you don't have to worry about quite so much.
Mm-hmm. And certainly PCs will sometimes, instead of clumping, particularly the ranged people, they'll scatter. But then, if you know what the map of the room looks like and they've scattered out to the walls, then you can say, okay, they've scattered out to the walls. And then, again, in the charitable assumptions of PCs, you assume they've scattered in the most favorable way for themselves. And then you look at, all right, well, that's about where they would be. And then, so the opponent can't, so they can't be AoE'd by this thing. Or there's no, is there, so like, let's say that you're looking at this person
You can also
fireball.
ask questions. When they say, oh, we're going to scatter out to the walls, you say, so why are you scattering? And if they say, well, we don't want to get a lot of people hit by a fireball, then you can be charitable with the spacing of a fireball. Whereas if they just say, oh, we don't want to be within the reach, all within the reach of that troll, then the spacing would be different.
Yeah, especially if you know that some of them have abilities where they would want to be closer to each other to interact with each other.
That's right. And you can ask, like, are you moving to be next to the fighter with Shield Warden if they're moving towards that direction? Or it's like, do you want to be next to the fighter with Shield Warden or flanking with the fighter with Shield Warden? And then they can decide, do they want the shield protection? Do they want the flank? There's other ways to get flat-footed, so there's not that many other ways to get someone to block for you with a shield. So they can decide.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to another point where Theater of the Mind is a lot easier to do with an ongoing group. I don't do Theater of the Mind when I'm running society games for people that I'm not very familiar with, and characters I'm not very familiar with, because I do definitely struggle with it when I'm not familiar with the character abilities and how they play together to try to map things out. So in that case, I will go ahead and use a physical battle map. But I do really enjoy doing Theater of the Mind in home games because I find that it's easier in a lot of ways for me. I mean, I know that there's a lot of really great virtual tabletops out there, but it does take time to set up and create the virtual minis and create the maps and get everything set up versus just being able to be... I feel that it makes me more flexible as well if the PCs want to go do an encounter in an unexpected location, if they attack people that I didn't expect they were going to attack. If
Take
I'm
that,
just
Bob
if
the Guard.
if I'm just deciding in terms of pacing that it would be good to throw an encounter here, and maybe they've been messing around with these diabolists, and I want them to fight a devil, I can just say, boom, okay, what's an appropriate CR devil encounter here? Okay, well, maybe CR 13, so I'll take an encounter that adds up to CR 13, I'll toss them in a room over here, and here's the devils, and I didn't have to set up minis, all I had to do was pop out the stat block, and here we go. So I think that's an advantage of Theater of the Mind, is that it's flexible, and it can be done when you can do Theater of the Mind when all you have is a phone. Like if somebody's call quality is bad, and all they have is just the audio signal, whether it's a phone or a spotty internet because they're in another country, and and the quality is low, which we've had sometimes, it doesn't matter.
Or in the hotel lobby.
Or in a hotel lobby somewhere. Yeah, it's just if you have any way to communicate at all, then you can do theater of the mind.
That's true. Apple Knee suggests a whiteboard or some kind of sketch for basic positioning. We've definitely used that idea before, where we would just send sort of like a little paint sketch of certain important information really quickly.
So it's like, okay, here's the room, here's the room, here's the danger area, here's the clump of these people, 30 feet. Here's the clump of these people, 40 feet. Here's the clump of these people, 50 feet. This is what the room roughly looks like.
Yep. It also just, in some ways, if you're deciding theater of the mind, like, certain players respond better to theater of the mind, and certain players respond better to miniatures, maps, and lots of representation. And it depends from player to player. Most players actually, at the very least, have a better sense of the room with representation. But, for instance, I actually do well with theater of the mind or with very sparse and poorly defined representation, like a whiteboard or something that's scribbled down and has like some coins or something very basic, because the more that the pieces start becoming the characters, because oh my gosh, this mini is exactly what we're fighting, this mini is exactly my PC, and there's three-dimensional terrain and it looks exactly like the place, the more that I'm just sort of like this giant deity looking down on the scene from above, and those miniatures and that map is the reality, and the less that it looks like the scene correctly, the more that in my head is the reality and I am the character rather than like the piece of plastic being the character.
Yeah.
And I get problems with that, but not like everyone has strengths and weaknesses, and we've talked a lot about some of our strengths on episodes, but one of my weaknesses is the fact that I can get pulled out of my character by too much representation being there in props.
But I think that to a lesser extent that does happen with a lot of people, that the theater of the mind style, if it does work for them, encourages creativity in the way that you describe things, because you no longer have that element of counting out the squares as you're moving. And particularly, I think for people who've played a fair number of those tactical RPGs, like, you know, your Fire Emblems and things like that, where you're going around and you're counting out the pieces and you're trying to strategize it exactly perfectly.
Turn on the purple, see where they can go.
Yes, turn on the purple and see where their attack radius is, and like, am I going to be in the attack radius of this specific one? So Spartans asked, what tips would you give GMs who use theater of the mind but lack in descriptions? So when you're saying lack in descriptions, I mean, you can certainly do theater of the mind without...
You don't need lavish descriptions.
Without lavish descriptions.
As long as you give clear, concise information about what is necessary. Mm-hmm. Even if you don't, like, say, and the tapestry is made of brilliant pigments of ochre and vermilion that have been brought over from the faraway lands of and just keep going like that.
It ripples gently in an unseen wind.
An unseen wind.
The source seems ethereal.
An ethereal zephyr.
Yep. I mean, we could go on and on with stereotypical, overblown descriptions.
Yeah, but we were both about to say ethereal.
Yeah, well, ethereal needed to be in there somewhere. Ethereal filigree, perhaps? Did the tapestry dominate the room?
And Stump Monkey points out the players will fill in a ton of info themselves as they're trying to imagine the scene, and also suggested online whiteboards, which we have used before, sometimes for sketching things in. That is definitely true.
So I'd say description-wise...
Now, it's usually, but not always a good thing when the players fill in the information. Usually it's good, but sometimes when they fill in something that's not there and there's a combat and they want to rely on it, they're like, I'll swing on the chandelier. And you're like, well, there aren't any chandeliers. But I filled in a chandelier. Then you can sometimes come into an issue, or you can just go with it and be like, sure, there's a chandelier, and you swing on the chandelier.
Yeah, I mean, if it seems like a kind of room that would have a chandelier, as long as
But if it's like a cave, but
Yeah.
you just were not good at description, so you're like, you go into this room and there's an orc and a pie, and it was important that it was a cave, because later one of the like stalagmites was a roper.
Mhm.
But you just said this room, and then they're like, oh well, I imagine it's a ballroom where there's a giant dining table with pie, and therefore there's a chandelier. Then
Yeah.
it's like I swing on this chandelier. So I'm gonna like surf on on like one of the plates on the dining table and go. It's like, yeah, hold on. There's not a dining table
It's not
or
a dining
chandelier.
table, but
It is a giant cave, but you could like use a rope to one of the stalactites and try to swing on that.
yeah. So it's certainly important to make sure that any time that you and the players weren't on the same page about what happens, that you make sure that you're on the same page before anyone commits to their actions.
That's right. Like, after they've swung on the chandelier is a bad time to tell them that there is not a chandelier. It's like, sorry, actually, you just fall on your ass because there was no chandelier to begin with, and you tried to swing on it like a noob.
I mean,
How to not theater of the mind.
Yeah. I mean, hypothetical
I was just like,
straw-manishly,
oh, I'm swinging.
straw-manishly bad GMs aside. Yeah. So describing the location. So I guess to go back to it, what matters most in the description is what are the physical features of the room that are relevant to the combat, and what are the relative positions of the opponents versus the pieces.
If the opponents move their relative positions, try to make it very clear where they are now. Like, in our 30, 40, 50 triangle, if the troll moves, it's like, okay, the troll goes over from that northeast group fighting the fighter down 50 feet to the southern group where the wizard is. The troll's just fed up with all of that acid splash and produce flame that the wizard's been doing and wants to get some revenge.
And then so because he said like it's fed up with the wizard and wants to get revenge, this makes it very clear that they're going for the wizard, and it also makes it clear that the wizard's actions in the combat have mattered. They've upset the foes. And you used cardinal directions in that description. You know, northeast group, south group. You can certainly use cardinal. It's good to have identifiers for these groups. So whether that's cardinal directions or
you could just say back towards the door.
Back toward the door.
If the door was in the south, and that's why the wizard's back there.
Or the door, or if there's multiple doors, you know, this heads over to the wizard, or heads over to the door by the door into the dungeon, or heads over toward the door you haven't opened yet on
or
the north
even
side
just
of the room.
to the wizard's group if it's very clear where the three groups are.
Yeah. I find that switching up the way you describe the group can sometimes be helpful if people are getting confused. You know, if you just say like the wizard's group,
Wait,
which
wouldn't
is by
that
the
make
door.
people even more confused if you do it when they were starting to get confused?
I didn't. Sorry, I misspoke. I didn't mean switching it up. I meant giving multiple descriptors.
Oh, okay.
So that's why I said the wizard's group, which is over by the door.
I thought you were being like, there's someone confused. Therefore, I'll call the group a different name each time.
No,
that'll straighten them out.
Go away, Parody GM. It is true that I misspoke, so thank you for pointing that out.
Everyone likes Parody GM.
Oh, Parody
Easy
GM.
to make fun of Parody GM.
Parody GM, you're always doing
thing.
literally the worst thing.
Of course they are.
Yeah. Okay, so what were we...
we were basically talking about how to make sure you can handle theater of the mind even if you are not the type of person who does theater of description.
Yeah. So I suppose another good thing to talk about would be finding which combats and which situations are going to work well for you and your group in Theater of the Mind versus which ones won't. So, if you're and how to start off introducing your group to Theater of the Mind and see if it works well. So certainly starting with a lower complexity encounter makes a lot of sense for testing out Theater of the Mind. An encounter that's in a relatively straightforward rectangular room without that many obstacles with the opponents are all melee,
or
and they come up
melee
and
and
do things.
archers.
Or there's
Not
melee.
any that are going to do area effects, because
Yeah.
those are some of the most difficult to
Yeah.
adjudicate.
So starting off with something more simple and seeing how your group responds to that, if they enjoy that or if they're getting frustrated by it, because I know it can be frustrating for some players. And as with anything else that you try out, if your players aren't into it, then it's an experiment that you tried, but it didn't really work out well for you. So starting off with encounters that are simpler, and also lower level. Theater of the Mind isn't necessarily the best thing to suddenly introduce when you're at higher levels and the players are used to using their characters who have lots of different complex options and abilities. They've never used it before. So you can try it out with a lower level one shot, such as using a society scenario, for example, just to get a feel for
Do
how that works for you
Sandstone
guys.
Secret.
You can do Sandstone Secret, for example. But yeah, you can give it a shot with these simpler encounters with lower levels, and then build up and try different things. And be ready, though. When you're trying it out, be ready to pull out the map if needed. Whether that is ready to you pull out a battle map and sketch a quick map, or sketch something on a whiteboard if they're physically there, or to do something on a shared, to do something on a shared experience in another way, like a virtual tabletop. Spartan said they usually use theater at the beginning of one shots and then go on to a tabletop. That's certainly something that you can do as well. It's not an all or nothing thing. It can certainly be a mix and match thing where your more intricate and complicated or set piece combats are done with battle maps, and then you have theater of the mind for the other things. And that can definitely create an interesting transition as well for players between, the battle map came out, now things are getting serious. I've had that experience with some of my encounters in Keymaker, which I ran mostly theater of the mind. But then once we do get that battle map out and we are doing this more planning, then it sort of signals to the players, something more complex is going on here.
There's also one other time that it can be very tough to use Theater of the Mind, or if you do, it might cause friction, which is if you as the GM are just vastly worse at tactical play than the players, or at least maybe one of the players who always quarterbacks all the other players, then it can be a problem, because when we say err on the side of the players and help them with pathfinding because they can't see everything, but you can in your head where you're keeping it. If they're just way better than you at all that stuff, they're still going to actually be disadvantaged. It helps if the group is on equal footing, roughly. I mean, if they're a little better, it doesn't matter, because you're still the GM and you can figure it out. Also, if you're better at that kind of stuff, it works too. But because at that point, with your GM ability to help a little bit with pathfinding, you'll be giving them sort of an advantage or an equal footing, one or the other. And players tend to be more okay with that, especially if it pushes them towards the type of things that they like more in combat and out of combat. So, but do keep in mind, we're saying how to run Theater of the Mind, but it is literally possible that if your weakness is not being able to apply those combats very well, or even if you were a player not being able to move and use your character as well, but your strengths are in role playing and other areas, it may seem paradoxical that someone who, because Theater of the Mind is often noted for groups that have a lot of role playing, but you need to have at least a certain amount of tactical acumen to be able to adjudicate a Theater of the Mind encounter fairly. And once you've got that, and I think most people probably do, unless that's just your weakness, like my weakness is being distracted by representations, is one of my weaknesses anyway, and or unless you've got some kind of Sun Tzu in your group who is just constantly perplexing you with what they're doing.
You said that it would take me 20 feet of move to do this, and I would still have move left to do whatever other thing that I'm doing based on my combo. But I could actually do it in 15 feet if I use the diagonals in this particular way, and I'm using this ability, and yada yada yada, and then you get in a confused argument with the player, and that's not fun.
Yep.
But I guess another thing to point out if you're getting started with Theater of the Mind combat, it's entirely possible, particularly if you're running virtually, for the GM to have more of a representation that they're using. I've done it before with like a little tiny battle map where I have little dots or little pieces of paper that I shuffle around when I was getting started with this to assist me in planning and getting to know how these things work. Or with players being virtual, I could just literally do that on a little battle map of my own and get comfortable and familiar with the concept. But yeah, Theater of the Mind combat does I find tend to run a little faster. If you have a group that's really into it, it tends to run a little faster.
Sometimes a lot faster.
If not a lot faster.
Because no one has to agonize over where they're pathing their character.
It tends to lead to less frustration from players who feel bad if they think that they made a mistake. Because if I had gone into this square, then I wouldn't have been in this fireball. Because you can just err on the side of the player and then say like, oh, you were just out of the fireball, because you know they could have been just out of the fireball.
And the players who feel bad about mistakes are often analysis paralysis players, so you prevent them from analysis paralysing as much.
Mm-hmm. So analysis paralysis being, I suppose, what it sounds like, the thing when a player of any game, really, not just a tabletop, spends so much time considering all of their options that it dramatically slows down the flow of the game and causes an issue for others at the table.
Yep. It's often related to a feeling of helplessness or worthlessness if they don't pick just the right move, and as if they will be judged by the other players, even though actually they're usually being judged by the other players for wasting everyone's time, but it's not rational. So
yeah, I mean, that's certainly something that I dealt with early in my time as a player.
You've never been the number one analysis paralysis person.
I have never been the number one in the group, that's for sure. But I'm saying it's certainly something that I dealt with to an extent. Is that feeling of, am I going to be good enough? Am I going to be holding back the team?
Based on other things that I know about you, you easily could have been, but usually, for some reason, in Pathfinder and D&D, you would just pick a thing and then later realize you had forgotten, oh yeah, we were going against Dark Lycanthropes, and I have an ability that destroys them.
Yep. Well, I was kind of the joke that, like, my first 5 game sessions...
You had exactly the ability.
Well, you didn't remind me that I had the ability, and I didn't know what the heck I was doing.
Well, I wasn't going to quarterback your character.
I appreciate that you didn't quarterback my character.
You picked good moves. You just happen to have exact counters to things.
This is what happens when you start a 7th level character with a part cleric, part prestige class, and you never played Pathfinder, or I guess it was 3.5 before. You never played any tabletop role-playing game before.
Oh, bonsoir, Ikam.
Welcome.
I almost said bonjour, but I was like, wait a minute.
Let's see. For players whose entire build is based on breach weapons, are the ones that have most problems with in Theater of the Mind. Even if you're super generous, they can often worry if they're missing out. Yeah.
I've had it happen occasionally where someone with a reach weapon is like, what? They really got around without going into my reach? And I just had to say, yes, they did.
Mm-hmm.
One of our players in particular sometimes used to ask that with reach weapons. It's less of a concern in PF2 because of the fact that there's usually not as many attack of opportunity with reach weapons, and I guess that person has never had a reach weapon yet, so we'll see. But sometimes when he had 5 or 6 reach attacks coming, and he still got some of them, but certain enemies were in a position where they didn't have to go into his reach if they just went around a little bit. He was hoping to get them all.
Yeah, and you can sort of help with that a little bit in terms of how you describe things. You describe them like, taking a wide swinging arc around your weapon or something like that. And then if you make a point of the times when that makes them, in 2nd edition, they had to spend another action to get around to avoid their weapon, or things like that, then you're making a point of how their reach weapon is still impacting the combat. And yeah, sometimes you just have to say, yeah, they They could make it. They had enough movement to make it around you. They saw what your attack of opportunity did to that other guy, and they didn't want to be next.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, how many people here have done Theater of the Mind combat before?
Yeah, chime in if you have done Theater of the Mind before.
And what your experiences have been.
And Numbat is talking about learning which players to quietly ask for advice on how to do something or what the rules were when starting out. That can be very helpful as well, because if you don't approach someone, there's a lot of times that people assume the social contract is either not to offer advice, or people try to offer advice and aren't sure if they're going to be judged for offering advice.
Or they offer too much advice,
Yep.
and then they're that guy.
Yep, or will they be judged as being that guy? Are they helping new players? I tend to offer advice to new players, but not tell them what to do. I try to give them multiple options each time so that conceivably, even if the one that they pick is not the best one, that they are still choosing if they seem like they were just completely afloat.
If they're just like, and then they look around the table for guidance, it's like, well, you're a rogue, so you're pretty good at attacking. If you have a flank, you can backstab this person, or go around and backstab this person, or you could go around and backstab this person, or you can be more defensive and make an attack from the shadows, or etc. You can.
So GM Reckless, Cobalt Crusader, to an extent, have done Theater of the Mind. It looks like Jim has done it, but not in Pathfinder. And Kubets is apologizing for not asking a ton of questions due to extreme internet lag. Let's see. Stump Monkey ran most of Kingmaker in Theater of the Mind. So did Linda.
Mm-hmm.
And Shadows over Scotland does for 13th Age. And Night Fox has done it a few times. So it looks like a lot of people have done it sometimes, but not all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We do so most of the time. Like we said, in our home group anyway, for Pathfinder Society, I usually assume that at least some of the players in Pathfinder Society couldn't deal with Player of the Mind, because I don't want them to have to come to me and tell me they can't deal with Theater of the Mind, because that's the situation that puts an onus and a stress on them. So I put it on myself by running Theater of the Mind.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but that's part of why when we do GM, when Mark does GM, the minis that he uses are generally fairly random. They're like the right size category, but they're not necessarily representative of the creature. And I do that as well with large groups of enemies that are the same thing. So if the PCs walk into a room and they're fighting 6 mummies, I'm not going to use minis that all look like mummies or that all look very similar, because then I'll get confused. So what I'll do is I'll remember, like, if there's a group of enemies that are all the same, I'll use very different minis, and then I'll write them into the initiative order instead of Mummy A, Mummy B, Mummy C, with like even with little colored dots, I get confused. So I would write, Mummy. It'd be like Mummy parentheses Elven Archer. So I would be like, okay, and then I'll tell everybody in this group, these are all mummies. And then if it's like 6 mummies and a necromancer, then I would do a necromancer-looking mini for the necromancer. Be like, this is a necromancer. All these completely random minis here are mummies. And then people will latch onto that. And I find that helps with people keeping things straight, too, in terms of, which one's injured and that kind of thing.
We definitely, in the weird homebrewed Arthurian game where there was a tournament, we definitely had a situation where, like, we always had the bard or herald of the group, of the enemy group, as like a frog.
Yep.
So it became known as like, oh, it's the frog. That's their bard.
Yep.
It's a giant toad.
The giant toad mini.
Mm-hmm.
So in long tournament groups, yeah, you can totally do themes for your minis as well.
Yes, Night Fox Theater of the Mind is without minis. We're kind of talking about when we have to use minis, or times that you wouldn't use Theater of the Mind. And Apple Knees brings up a very good example of why I don't ask for Pathfinder Society. I just run in not Theater of the Mind because I wouldn't want to put someone like Apple News on the spot where they have to say, oh no, I can't handle Theater of the Mind and I don't want to ask the questions, but then they have to feel awkward that they've said that and not just agreed, and it's just not a good situation for the player.
Yeah. Theater of the Mind also is harder the more tired people are. I find that especially if you as the GM are very tired and it's the complicated combat, that's when I'm going to be breaking out more and more aids for myself to keep track of things. Or even enlisting players to assist me in keeping track of the state of battle.
Also, if everyone is tired enough, Theater of the Mind can sometimes work fine because you'll actually slip up, but no one will care because they're also tired.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with the minis, they're kind of just there, and if you slip up, someone will notice. But normally, if the GM's not tired and the other people are tired, Theater of the Mind actually helps a lot because the GM can keep track of everything. Yeah, Kubets, having 7 players and a battle map and all the enemies can definitely cause issues. But Theater of the Mind also, with that many characters, that we have 7 in War for the Crown, they sometimes all come. So,
Mm-hmm.
we've had situations where there's a lot of mobility, like, what was it? There was that one fight where Linda's fighter was, like, off to the side, and there were these ghosts using an ectoplasmic trample ability, and these graves that were extra-dimensional and kept trying to swallow people.
Yeah, that just happened.
Yeah, that was recent.
And then you had to figure out, like, who all was in a line with each other.
Yeah, but fortunately, everyone in the party except for Linda were kind of all in a clump. Sort of fending off those graves, and just the trampling ghosts were so fast they could just trample through everybody.
Yeah, because it was more of a loop. That's right.
They don't have to go in a straight line. They just get to move twice their speed.
That's right. But in terms of lines, I tend to assume with lines that after the first time the line goes down, if the players say like, "Oh, we're going to scatter out," that they have positioned themselves such that no more than 2 of them are in a line with each other, and it's like, oh, you can only hit 2 if there's a big enough space for it. So it's like, okay, yeah. Of course, you can always.
If you're in a corridor,
there's nowhere you can go, and of course, you can always make a line between any 2 PCs, but that they at least scatter themselves out pretty well.
And Hito Owen mentions it reduces prep time a lot because drawing it out is a lot of prep, or a lot of time during the session. That is true. That is very helpful for us as well. And how long have we both been playing with each other in our group? Well, for basically as long as I've known Linda.
Yeah, I mean, you recruited me to your game the day I met you.
That's true.
So
basically.
I suppose.
You weren't technically playing yet. You were making your character.
I was making my character. That's true. Was our first section before or after our first date? I feel like it may have been after.
I think.
Because like everyone had to come back.
I can't. Yeah, I think it may have been after.
Yeah.
Yeah, Night Fox is talking about I wouldn't have done that action if I knew that, and yeah, Night Fox just tuned in. I think very recently of like, hi folks, yeah.
Yeah.
So we talked about that earlier. Basically, as the GM, you did not do gotcha. There was a section slightly earlier about if they're like, I'm gonna go flank that guy, and you know that it walks off a cliff to go flank him because the spot behind him is a giant cliff. Then you don't be, oh sure, ha ha ha, you're dead now because you walked off a cliff.
Or like if you know that it's to be clear to the PC that they would provoke like 5 AOs if they take this path, and then it's like, okay, but like everybody has the weapons out. How often do we both get to play at the same table? We do in our Iron Fang Invasion game, which we haven't played in a while because War for the Crown has been the priority.
Hold on, pedantry. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition,
yes.
the book makes it very clear that the GM is one of the players.
Okay,
because it calls the other ones the other players. So that means that when I'm running War for the Crown and you're playing, that we are technically also both playing. But it's not at a table because it's at this desk and you're on the floor, so I don't even know anymore.
I believe that immediately have given the actual answer to the question and then dissolved into a squirrel made of pedantry.
I don't even know if it's a squirrel because it's on topic pedantry. All right,
Yeah.
but that aside, yeah, basically Iron Fang invasion, and then occasionally, I don't even know the last time we've. That's not even a physical. I don't. When is the last time we've sat down at a physical table where both of us were playing?
And you're talking about a
Physical table.
Are you talking? Well, are you only counting Pathfinder?
Yeah, I'm counting tabletop RPG.
Well, it's Strange
but,
then.
Oh yeah, well I guess it's the Strange when Ron's running the Strange.
When Ron's runs the Strange, because we do
Yeah,
we
we
do
can
that
count
like
that.
roughly every other week, which is to say like every month to month and a half because gamers.
It's every other week except for if Ron can't do it, which is a reasonable percentage of the time. But so yeah, when we play the Strange, that's when we're both players and not GMs, and we're at a table.
But when's the last time we played Pathfinder together? I can't. Where we were both players at the same table. It would have been probably our last session of Iron Fang, which was I don't know.
But
a year
that's
ago?
not a I'm talking about going to a table.
Forget you.
I'm not even sure that we have. Because if you had been one of the guest players when Logan was running the in-house play test
Yes.
of Doomsday Dawn, which you weren't, then we could have theoretically both been players.
Yeah.
But that didn't happen. Does it count if Linda's running an AP and also has characters that she's playing, and I have characters that we're playing, we're the only two players, and she's the GM?
Well, now you're getting into technicalities where you don't count the game if I'm sitting on a couch and you're sitting at your computer desk.
Apple News says it counts.
Okay, yes. So then that was...
Yes-ish.
All right.
Okay. Well, we've definitely done that a little bit too. And we've done that for Skull and Shackles as well as some Fate, but that's been a while.
Fate's been... Have we even played Fate since we've moved to this house?
No.
So then it would be over 5 years.
Yep. It's been a long time.
It's been a long time.
Yep. There you go, Enterprise. Alright, so, Slash Squirrel.
Yep.
Any other questions that you guys have about Theater of the Mind? It clearly has an R-E in it, as opposed to Theater of the Mind.
Would you like to discuss R-E versus E-R?
Well, ER is like the building is like, oh, I've gone to the theater, whereas RE is like sort of the pompous theater people saying it is theater.
Alright.
RE could also stand for Rogue Eidolon.
It could?
I have been called RE before. Do you have to wear mental makeup to the theater of the mind? And does theater lore help?
I mean, I suppose it depends on what you call mental makeup. Is mental makeup the way that you prepare and present yourself to players? Have you ever used Theater of the Mind when your characters were in a theater? Yes. Council of Thieves.
Yeah, Six Trials of Larazad.
Six Trials of Larazad. Yes.
That's definitely true.
And does theater lore help you with Theater of the Mind? Probably only if your characters were actually in a theater.
Although our characters would be in a theater and not a theater.
Oh my god.
But there's definitely been encounters that are in a theater, like that one in what is it? One of the Shadow Lodge adventures has one that's in a theater.
Is that a part 2 of something?
Or it's like there's that bard.
I know there's that bard, and that bard is a jerk, and he uses the theater map.
And we use Theater of the Mind in that theater as well.
Spartans, I do like pineapple on pizza.
But I don't. So, the answer is no to pineapple or no pineapple, but instead it is... Or no, only if it's an XOR. So you can decide. The answer could be true.
Yeah, but, I mean, pineapple goes really well on Hawaiian pizza, and he's a vegetarian, so he can't appreciate the splendor that is ham and pineapple together on a pizza.
So let's see. Couldn't you have Theater of the Mind inside of a mindscape? You potentially
Yes.
could.
I think we've done that before too.
Yeah, I think we've done Theater of the Mind inside of a Mindscape.
Yes.
And we could be doing it again soon. Let's see. Entertainment lore got changed to theater lore. That's true. It's more obvious that it is about theater. Have you even done Theater of the Mind where both the players and the characters were in a theater? And did it feel like Inception? If so, let me see about that. I don't think we've done Theater of the Mind where both the players and the characters were in a theater.
No, I'm trying to think of any of the conventions that I've jammed in
Use the theater
we're
room.
technically in a theater room, but then in that case it would be convention jamming, so I would be using a map.
Also, like,
Although I do occasionally use Theater of the Mind for very simple and short combats in society play, but not often.
would you use alternate props in Theater of the Mind to ease cognitive load? So different locations sketched on a sheet of paper. Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
We talked about using like a online whiteboard or just a sketch pad or something to give very very simple instructions or information.
Yeah, or we've also done if the PCs have pre-scouted or gained the map of the location before just sending them the map. I've used ball and stick maps as well, just to, especially if people might be moving around between rooms, to simplify that. What is your next messy movie?
I think probably Avengers
Endgame,
Endgame
which we still haven't seen.
when it comes up on Netflix.
Yep.
So whenever that's on Netflix, we're gonna see it on Netflix.
Unless it doesn't come up on Netflix because of the Disney thing.
Yeah, then in that case, if it comes up on Hulu,
Yeah.
then we can see it on Hulu.
Yep.
Just some online source of seeing movies.
Yep.
So don't tell us what happened in Endgame. For us, Theater of the Mind comes up when people don't want to get up or the GM doesn't want to draw a map, says Night Fox. Well, it can arise from laziness, but in a lot of cases it arises just from a group that actually finds there to be an advantage running Theater of the Mind for themselves.
Like I was talking about, I find it to be an advantage in terms of games where you want to have spontaneity in what kinds of encounters and situations.
Like if you have a random encounter table, you can't really roll that randomly if you're going to be doing everything out as a major production.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we have indeed been rather busy lately, Applebee's.
Yep. Plus, also, I personally prefer watching movies at home where I can talk about them with Linda, or we can complain that Star-Lord is an idiot. Minor spoiler for Infinity Wars that everyone has seen. But if you're in the theater, then you can't really, like, I know a lot of people go to theaters with friends, but you can't talk to your friends, and I barely get to do things outside of work with friends anyway, so I usually would prefer, like, just about any activity other than going to a movie theater with
Plus,
friends.
you often get headaches from the volume of
It's also
movie
very
theaters
loud.
as well.
But that notwithstanding, I just feel like if I'm going to do something with friends, I want to be able to talk to them. And similarly, I enjoy movies more when they're sort of like at my own pace and just we can do what we want. So I rarely see them in theaters.
And you can like pause, and it's like somebody needs to go to the bathroom or get a snack or whatever. You pause and they don't
Rather
miss
than
anything.
missing like a crucial
And
scene.
we can snark at each other.
See, Stunt Monkey has my back on the friends at movies.
Especially if you want to watch a bad movie. Bad movies are so much better when you're watching them with friends and you can make fun of them.
Yup.
Oh yeah, Star-Lord. Poor Star-Lord.
I don't know. I've personally played like telepath characters. Like, I've literally played a telepath scion in 3.5 who was like, our party was being attacked by a way above our level boule, and we had a strategy, and the strategy was that I was going to ego whip it while everyone else ran away and distracted it, and then the Star-Lord person just goes up and starts whacking it in melee and breaking the strategy, like, or just any time where you have something fascinated, it's like, I fascinated this enemy that's half the encounter, go fight the other things, then we come back, and then, oh no, I'm going to attack it anyway. Like, that happens a lot in RPGs, so I can really feel for Mantis there. Star-Lord is just like, what are you doing?
And, Gemma, or Jim, I really liked Spider-Verse 2. That was the most recent movie we saw.
Yes, that's the most recent movie we saw, but we also saw it at home because it's on Netflix.
In terms of must-have games at Gen Con, I wouldn't say we necessarily did. I mean, we didn't have that much time to go around, but we did get a chance to play a few games that were fun after the fact. What was I liked that animals one, the T one.
Oh, the one that Jason didn't like?
The one that Jason didn't like. Yeah, it was really cute. And I also liked the Tetris one. And
there are a bunch
the
of
Q one
games
that was
that
like the little tiny games.
Joe, Adrian, and Jason Keeley had some games, and we played them, and Jason Bowman came down and played with us, and he bought I think every game that that Joe, Adrian, and Jason Keeley showed us except the T Animals game.
Yeah, but I liked the T Animals game. I wasn't very good at it because it was Monday of Gen Con, and I was like, how does a pattern work? But it was still adorable, and it was a fun little challenge.
Yeah, it was
I feel like I wouldn't want to play with you, though, because you would definitely still win every time, even when we weren't tired.
It's weird because it's not the type of game that I'm super good at. You're just like laying transparencies down to try to get animals to show up based on some of them covering up other ones, which is... Those are not the games I'm usually the best at, but I happen to do well at that one due to like one or two heuristics that I'm sure everyone else would have learned after a few more games.
Just to check, are we done talking about Theater of the Mind? Because if not, let's talk about Theater of the Mind some now so that I can more easily, after I've just raised my hands as a signal to myself for editing, so that I can more easily cut Theater of the Mind in. Since it really does seem that we've gone into our just kind of hang out with Twitch folks thing.
Yeah, I know about Spider-Verse having like the frame rate, and then you could look on the screen and sort of see the dots like it was a comic book being shaded in. That was one of the cool things about it, was sort of the style. And I guess it makes sense that people other than us, Pathfinder 2nd Edition was probably one of the big games that they bought at the convention. Alright, looks like we're probably done with Theater of the Mind.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the reason I picked Theater of the Mind as a topic for today, because I knew we were tired, and that Theater of the Mind would be a topic that could be covered fairly efficiently.
We have talked now about theaters, and
Yes.
we've also talked about games at Gen Con. So yeah, I never wound up finding games at Gen Con at all, other than the ones that we played that other people brought in. But there were a lot of interesting games that we played that other people brought in.
Yeah, I mean, that is one advantage to having the flight that doesn't leave until like 6:30 on Monday, is that Paizo folks basically slept in as late as the Hotel China would let us, and then we congregated in the lobby of the Omni and broke out and
Wait a
talked
minute,
for a while.
Night Fox is right. We didn't talk about The Mind. So
Oh, yeah,
The
we
Mind
talked
is a
about The
really
Mind.
interesting game
Yeah,
where you kind of don't say anything, but that you have to try to put the numbers in the right order. And I want to point out that because Steven wasn't there that day, our current design team actually first played The Mind, and Jason didn't explain the directions quite right, so Logan was playing it wrong. And we figured that out like almost immediately. So we started again, and Jason explained the directions completely, and we won. So we must have like really good design team mind reading mojo, that, or just the ability that we worked together for years.
So for folks who haven't played The Mind before, the basic mechanic of it is pretty straightforward. Everybody gets dealt. There are cards in the deck from 1 to 100, and you deal out you deal them out to people. So in the first round, everybody gets one card. All that you know is that the deck contained cards from 1 to 100, and your goal is to put the cards out on the table in sequential order from lowest to highest. You cannot talk, so your only communication with, or like you cannot talk in any way. You write or communicate in anything other than basic body language, no sign language or anything like that. So you're basically just like staring at people, being like, do you think that it's? Like, do I think this is my card? Am I next? So if you have a card that's really low, then if you got like a single digit number the first round, you're probably just going to be like, boom. But if you got like a really high card, then you might be like leaning back and tapping your foot.
So
and what
you have to play your own lowest card. You can't play a card that you yourself would not be would be the wrong card. But if your card is not the lowest, everyone tosses all the cards that are lower than it, and you lose a life, which you have a very limited numbers of. There's also a like a little clue shuriken thing that you can do that you also have an extremely limited number of. But that, I can't remember right now. What did the shuriken do?
If you toss the shuriken, everyone discards their lowest card.
Oh, right. Everyone discards their lowest card. That's right.
Yeah.
And so, it's very interesting. There definitely were times that, that I was thinking of doing a weird strategy but decided not to. That we would have been okay, but I just didn't want to cost us a life, where it was like a later round, but for some reason I was dealt like a few really low cards and then an enormously high card, so that I could have thrown like a 99 like pretty early, and just obviously that wasn't the lowest card, but then everybody would put everything except for the 100, which I'm sure that really skilled players use that to try to get out of some of the harder rounds, but there definitely were just so many moments where two of us, when Jason, Logan, and I played, had consecutive cards, and we like just sort of stared at each other, and then
it's like
did
6,
it in
7, 8, 9.
we did it in the right order. So you're not allowed to communicate, but we sort of figured out our pacing, I guess. Anyway, it's considering how simple it is, the Mind is an interesting game, and
Also
Nightfox didn't
play
realize that it was a game. And Rexlick was talking about Fog of Love being a very interesting Theater of the Mind game. I feel like I saw an ad for it at Gen Con, but that's true of a lot of things. Like, when I walk the floor at Gen Con, I never actually check out a game, but I see a lot of, like, sights and sounds. So you name a thing, it's like, oh yeah, I feel like I saw something about that when I was walking along. 5-Minute Dungeon, GM Reckless, I feel like Joe and Adrian have played that in the office before. Yeah, I think so.
Joe's desk at work is basically like 1/4 space for him to actually work, 1/4 like Starfinder products, 1/4 toys, and 1/4 board games.
Pretty much.
It's pretty awesome, though.
All right. So I'm glad that everyone had sounded like had a good Gen Con and found more games than we did. To be fair, we couldn't find PF2.
I mean, we're also not there to find other games. We're there to
work every day and every night.
We're there to promote our games and our community.
Yep.
And it's always a lot of fun to meet people.
Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye.